What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
What if I told you that everything you believed about family loyalty could collapse in a single afternoon? Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because the person who ruined my life asked to hug me on my wedding day. But before I take you there, I have to tell you how it started, because if I jumped straight to the end, you would never understand why that text from my dad nearly made me throw my phone against the wall. I grew up in a house where my parents always said family was everything, and I believed them, right up until the moment my sister turned that word into a weapon. She was older, sharper with her words, and always carried this need to outshine me, though I thought sibling rivalry was normal. I never expected that she would spread lies so vicious they would convince my parents to throw me out. One day, out of nowhere, rumors started floating that I was sleeping around with anyone who gave me attention and, even worse, that I was selling substances. It was the kind of story that travels fast in a small community, especially when the person telling it has the last name everyone trusts. My sister used that trust like currency, and she spent it all destroying my reputation. The night my parents confronted me, I thought it was going to be one of those awkward family talks where you get scolded, but then hugged afterward. Instead, I walked into the living room to find them sitting with their arms crossed like I was already guilty of a crime. My mom said she couldn't believe what she had heard. My dad demanded to know how long it had been going on, and I sat there stunned, not even understanding what they were accusing me of. When I realized they actually believed I was promiscuous and dealing drugs, I laughed, thinking it was a sick joke. But their faces didn't crack. They told me to pack a bag. That was the moment I understood that in their eyes, gossip held more weight than the daughter they had raised. I spent the next few hours stuffing clothes into a bag while my mom avoided eye contact and my dad muttered about how I had embarrassed them. My sister hovered nearby with that smug expression. She was always so good at hiding when adults were around. No one asked for my side. No one questioned whether there was proof. My dad drove me to my aunt's place and dropped me off with 2 garbage bags and a warning not to come back until I got myself together. I was 19 years old, broke, and suddenly alone. The first few months were pure survival. I picked up extra shifts at work, slept on a pull-out couch, and tried not to think about the fact that the people who were supposed to protect me had abandoned me. But even in the middle of all that chaos, I did one thing right. I documented everything. Every text message, every Facebook post, every whispered accusation, I saved it. Something in me knew that one day, I might need proof that I wasn't crazy, that what happened to me wasn't just some phase or misunderstanding. I froze my credit the second I found out someone had tried to open an account under my name. At the time, I didn't know who it was, but looking back, it all points in the same direction. I went to HR at work and told them straight up that there were false rumors floating around, so if anything made it to the office, they'd hear the truth from me first. I didn't beg my parents to take me back, even though part of me wanted to. I sent one letter, typed and signed, telling them that if they ever wanted to have a relationship with me again, it would have to be through a mediator, because I wasn't going to keep defending myself against lies. I mailed it and never got a reply. For a long time, I tried to convince myself I didn't care, but it's impossible not to care when your own blood believes the worst about you without a shred of evidence. I spent nights crying into a pillow, wondering how long it would take for the truth to matter. My therapist told me that sometimes people don't want the truth, they want the story that's easiest to believe. My parents wanted to believe I was the problem, because then they didn't have to face the fact that my sister was capable of being cruel. Months later, when I had just started to feel like I was building something resembling a stable life, I stumbled across the first undeniable clue. A so-called anonymous email had been sent to my college dean warning that I was trouble and that the school should keep an eye on me. The language was weirdly specific, using a phrase that only my sister ever used when we were kids. It was something small, a phrase I had heard her repeat 100 times in arguments, and there it was, staring back at me in black and white. That was when I knew she wasn't just spreading whispers in the family. She had gone out of her way to poison my life in places that could have ruined my future. I told myself I'd deal with it later, but deep down, a seed had been planted. My sister thought she had won, thought she had erased me from the family, but she didn't realize she had also given me the one thing I needed most, a trail. And as I stared at that email, my hands shaking with rage, I whispered to myself that one day I would make her regret every word. Because here's the thing, banished doesn't mean broken. It just means waiting for the right moment. And I had no idea back then that the moment would arrive on the morning of my wedding, with a text from my dad that made my heart stop. But before I tell you that part, you should know this. The anonymous tip that started it all? It came from an account only one person in my family ever had access to. Guess who? I used to think survival meant clawing my way back to some version of approval, but after that first year drifting between my aunt's pull-out couch and a tiny sublet that smelled like old takeout, I learned that survival is quieter and far more stubborn than applause. Because it looks like paying bills on time while feeling like a ghost at every family event you are not invited to. It looks like showing up to work with puffy eyes and deciding you will not let anyone there define you by a rumor. They did not earn the right to repeat, and it looks like doing one unglamorous thing after another until your new life stops wobbling and starts standing on its own whether anyone claps or not. I kept my job by telling the truth before lies could walk through the door, and I sat in a therapist's office once a week using money I could have spent on something that felt nicer in the short term. Because I wanted long-term sanity more than I wanted short-term comfort, and if that sounds dramatic then. You have never been cut off by people who taught you to tell the truth and then punished you for doing it. I did not post about any of it, because I learned the hard way that some people do not want you healed, they want you noisy and messy so they can feel superior while calling it concern. So I went the opposite direction and became careful, almost boring, and absolutely impossible to bait. At work, I told HR that if they ever received a complaint about me, it would likely come from people with my last name and not from anyone who had ever supervised me. And the woman across the table nodded in that way that says she has seen this before and said to keep documentation, which I was already doing with a level of precision my old self would have mocked, because it felt obsessive until the day it felt like armor. I bought a simple external drive and kept folders labeled by month with screenshots of texts, exports of group chats, and the kind of dull evidence that makes gossips wilt when it shows up in daylight, and I kept my credit frozen and my bank alerts turned on. And when I received a letter from a college office referring to an anonymous tip, I filed it with the others and added a note to myself that the strange phrase in that email matched my sister's favorite Barb from middle school, because the truth is that liars do not reinvent themselves every day, they recycle. And the patterns are there if you can stand to look at them without flinching. Somewhere in the middle of all that grim practicality, I met someone who did not need a polished story, a patient man who asked me questions like he had time to hear the full answers. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could say what had happened without performing it, and that did not fix anything with my parents, but it reminded me I was more than the family group chat's favorite cautionary tale. We made rules together that sound unromantic and saved my life anyway, like no responding to bait texts after dark, no surprise visits to anyone who had already said they did not want me there, and no sharing of personal documents without redacting the parts that do not belong to other people, which might sound like overkill until you remember that my own sister proved she could not be trusted with my name. The distance helped me see my parents with less heat and more clarity. They were not masterminds. They were convenience seekers who chose the easiest story to repeat, and the easiest story was the ugly one that made them feel decisive and righteous, and once I accepted that, I stopped trying to win them over with explanations and started counting who actually stood up for me when it cost them something. That is when I sent the first comm packet to the extended family, a neutral timeline made of dates, direct quotes, and the simplest kind of math, and I did not add adjectives because I wanted the facts to do all the talking while I did none. And at the end, I appended a short offer that said anyone who helped pass along the rumor could send a correction to the same threads, no groveling required, no speeches demanded, just a plain reversal sent to the same crowd, and a few cousins did it without drama, which told me something about who was reachable and who was addicted to the high of being the first to whisper. The pushback came from the usual corners where people confuse volume with virtue, and I let it sit there without answering, because I had learned that engagement is oxygen to the wrong fire and silence is a very effective extinguisher when paired with receipts. The part one did not expect arrived as a small, ugly surprise buried in my bank alerts. A microcharge test on a payments app one had never installed that used my name and an old email variation. And when I pulled the report, it showed a contact list seeded with numbers suspiciously close to my sister's circle, which is the kind of coincidence that stops feeling like coincidence the 10th time it happens. I called the company and asked for the account creation metadata, and while they would not give me anything juicy without a subpoena, they confirmed a device type and a window of time that matched a weekend my sister borrowed my old tablet years ago. A detail I had almost forgotten until it clanged into place like a lock turning. I sat there with my spreadsheet open, staring at the line items that looked like nothing to anyone else and everything to me, and I realized I was not chasing vindication anymore. I was building leverage, slow, legal, and boring leverage that no one could wave away as drama, and once that clicked, I stopped caring whether my parents would ever say sorry and started caring about whether they would ever correct the record where they had dirted it. So I doubled down on the grown-up plan, which was not revenge fireworks, but the kind of strategy that makes petty people feel trapped by their own shortcuts. And I told myself that when the right day came, I would ask for exactly 3 things in exactly the spaces where the damage was done, and I set about living like I was already free of them, because in every way that mattered I was. Then, months later, while I was finalizing the guest list with a venue that insisted on clear rules and 2 witnesses for any family meeting on site, I found something I could not ignore inside the payments export. A set of transfers labeled with my name in the note field, linked to small purchases that had been used as proof in early whispers about me living fast and reckless. And I felt my chest tighten as I scrolled through and realized I knew exactly whose hands had crafted that little stage play and exactly how I would make her take it apart in front of the same audience that watched her build it. By the time my life steadied enough for me to consider the future, I had already accepted that my parents would never be the cheering section at my graduation, the surprise visitors on my birthday, or the people proudly posting my milestones on Facebook. I stopped craving their approval the way I once did, because chasing it felt like running after a moving car while bleeding from the knees, humiliating and endless. What replaced that craving was something sturdier, a calm determination that the next chapter of my life, especially the day I promised myself to someone who had loved me without conditions, would not be tainted by the same people who tried so hard to make me small. If my sister had thought she wrote the first and final chapter of my reputation, she was going to learn that the ending belonged to me. When my fiancé proposed, I smiled and said yes with a joy I did not bother hiding, but deep inside, I also made a vow to myself. This wedding would be airtight against sabotage, no sudden speeches, no whispered interruptions, no spectacle where my family could play the victim while I stood frozen at the altar. I sat with spreadsheets and checklists like I was planning a military operation instead of a celebration, and maybe that sounds unromantic, but for me, it was the only way to make sure love would not be overshadowed by lies. We decided that every guest, family included, would have their phones checked at the door, not because I feared photos, but because I refused to risk a live stream meltdown designed to humiliate me in real time. Security staff were hired not for strangers, but for relatives, a quiet insurance policy against the kind of chaos only people who share your DNA can create. I also reserved a private side room at the venue, not for relaxation or tradition, but for one singular purpose: containment. If drama showed up in human form, that room would hold it until it either dissolved or was escorted out. The rules were clear. Anyone who violated them would leave, no matter their last name. And I put all of this in writing in a small packet mailed to relatives with their invitations, because I had learned that silence can be spun into weakness, but rules are hard to argue with when everyone else has agreed to them. Privately, I worked on something else, something less visible but far more important to me. I had already filed paperwork to change my last name before the wedding, not just because I wanted to share one with my husband, but because I wanted to be free of the one that had been twisted against me. This was not a sentimental gesture, it was a boundary made legal. I wanted no loose ends, no documents floating around that could be weaponized again, no way for my sister to drag my name into another round of fabricated stories. I wanted to walk into marriage under my own rules, carrying nothing that did not serve me. And because I had lived for years collecting proof, I did not walk into this wedding with just vows and flowers. I built what I called my apology pathway, a set of conditions I could present in plain language if my sister dared to show up with her crocodile tears. It was not a speech or a confrontation. It was a system. First, I drafted a short retraction statement written in her voice. No insults, no drama, just the truth laid out simply. She had lied. I had not done the things she said, and she regretted the pain caused. That retraction was ready to be read aloud, recorded as a voice memo, and posted directly into the same family group chat and church women's chat where the lies had once exploded. Second, I had a prepaid envelope waiting, addressed to my therapist's office, where she could begin repayment for the years I had covered my own sessions while she thrived on the chaos she created. I did not need the money, but I needed the act of accountability. Third, I had a notarized statement ready for her to sign, confirming the retraction, because apologies vanish, but paper remains. I also made quiet visits in the weeks leading up to the wedding, not to beg or warn, but to set foundations. I met with the leader of the church group that had once whispered about me like I was a cautionary tale, and I laid out the evidence in calm order, email headers and chat screenshots, the kind of details no one can refute. His face turned pale when he saw how thoroughly I had documented it all, and he asked what I wanted. I told him nothing yet, but if the day ever came that I needed a correction sent to the same mailing list, I expected him to do it without hesitation. He agreed, perhaps because he feared exposure, perhaps because guilt finally caught him. It did not matter why. It mattered that the groundwork was done. By the time the wedding week arrived, I was not nervous about flowers or cake flavors or seating charts. I was only focused on the possibility of sabotage and the certainty that if it came, I would not be caught off guard. My fiancé asked if it was worth the effort, if I could not just let the past stay buried. I told him the truth. The past does not bury itself. It claws at you until you force it back into the ground, and I had spent too many years with dirt under my fingernails. This day would be mine, or it would not happen at all. And then, on the very morning I was supposed to walk down the aisle, as I sat with my hair half pinned and my heart strangely steady, my phone buzzed with a message I had not expected to see. It was from my father, the man who had once dropped me off with garbage bags instead of luggage, the man who had chosen silence when I asked for mediation. The message was short, almost casual in tone, as if we had not lived through years of distance. He wrote, "Your sister regrets everything. Will you see her?" I stared at the screen, the world suddenly smaller than that one line, and I understood immediately that all my preparation had led to this exact moment, that everything I had built was about to be tested. When my father's message flashed across the screen, I felt a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a kind of cold clarity that only comes when you realize the moment you have been preparing for has finally arrived. Because as much as I had hardened myself to the idea that my sister would never admit anything, here she was, dangling an offer of regret through a man who had once abandoned me without hesitation. I did not answer right away, because I knew this was not a situation where emotion could take the lead, and I was not about to throw away years of careful rebuilding for a few shaky words of apology whispered at the wrong moment. Instead, I set the phone down, finished the last pin in my hair, looked at myself in the mirror, and said out loud that I would hear her, but I would do it on my terms and nowhere else. When I arrived at the venue, I instructed the staff exactly as planned, and then I walked into the small side room I had reserved weeks earlier, the one with only 2 chairs placed across from each other. It was almost comical to see how ordinary the room looked, because to me it felt like a courtroom, a confessional, and a battleground all in one, and I was both the plaintiff and the judge. My sister walked in with eyes already red, clutching tissues like a prop, and for a brief second I could see the same smug child who used to twist words against me, except now she was dressed in the costume of regret. She sat, waited for me to speak first, and when I didn't, she started with the usual script. She had been young, she had been jealous, she had been carried away by gossip, and she never realized it would go that far. I listened in silence until she paused long enough to take a breath, and then I slid the papers across the table, the retraction statement written in her own supposed voice, the instructions for recording a voice memo, and the envelope addressed to my therapist's office. I told her calmly that words were cheap and years too late, but actions were currency that still had value, and if she wanted any kind of acknowledgement from me on this day, she would complete those 3 actions before she left the room. She blinked at me as if I had spoken another language, then tried to laugh it off as crazy, but I did not flinch, and when she realized I would not back down, the panic started to show. She said I was ruining my own wedding with demands, and I reminded her that she had nearly ruined my life with lies, so if we were balancing scales, she was still in the red. I handed her my phone and told her to read the retraction exactly as it was written. No edits, no dramatics, just the truth. She tried bargaining, asking if we could talk first, and I repeated that she could read or she could leave, but the choice was entirely hers. Slowly, with a shaky voice, she began to read, each word sounding like it was made of glass in her mouth. She admitted the lies, she admitted the damage, and she admitted that I had done nothing she had accused me of. I pressed record before she started and held the phone steady, because I had learned never to trust words unless they were documented. When she finished, I saved the file, opened the family group chat, and made her hit send. For the first time in years, the truth lived in the same space where the lies had been born, and I felt a weight shift that no apology hug could ever match. Then I pushed the next step across the table, the voice memo addressed to our parents, one she had to record in her own words this time, not mine. She resisted, cried harder, accused me of being cruel, and I told her cruelty was making your own sibling homeless and a pariah, while accountability was simply calling things by their proper names. Eventually she gave in, pressed record, and spoke into the phone, saying she had lied, saying she regretted it, and saying that I had been telling the truth all along. Her voice cracked halfway through, but she got it out, and I saved that file as well. Finally, I placed the envelope in front of her, explaining that it was not about money, but about acknowledgement, because every therapy session I had scraped together had been a direct response to what she set in motion. And if she could sign her name and start sending payments, even small ones, then she could at least prove she understood the cost of her actions. She looked at me as if I had demanded her blood, but after a long silence she signed, sealed the envelope, and shoved it back across the table with trembling hands. I thanked her, not because I felt gratitude, but because I wanted her to understand that I had gotten exactly what I came for and nothing more. She asked if we could hug, and I said no, because forgiveness is not the same as access, and regret is not the same as repair. I stood, opened the door, and told her she could stay for the ceremony if she wanted, but from that moment forward, her only role was as a guest who had been given one final chance to act like family. Just as she walked past me, my mother's voice cut through the hallway, sharp and desperate, as she pounded on the door and shouted that I was breaking the family apart, a sentence so ironic I almost laughed. Because the family had been broken years ago when they chose lies over me. I stood in that doorway, watching my sister shrink into the hall, and for the first time in my life, I realized that I had finally stopped being the one on trial. I was no longer the defendant in their story. I was the one writing the record, and I had just turned my sister into her own witness against herself. When the door closed behind my sister and my mother's voice finally quieted, I felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over me. The kind that comes when you know the battle you have been fighting for years has already been decided and nothing that happens next can undo the verdict. I stood in that hallway, hearing the muffled sounds of guests arriving and the hum of the staff moving chairs, and I realized that for the first time since the night I was thrown out with 2 garbage bags, I was not carrying their accusations on my back. The retraction existed, the files were saved, the message had been sent, and the paper trail was sealed with her own signature. There was no undoing it, no version of the story where I was the liar or the black sheep. The truth was not just mine anymore, it was public, documented, undeniable, and echoing in the very spaces where the lies had first grown. I walked into the main hall with my head steady, not high or triumphant, just steady, because I did not need a dramatic moment to announce my victory. The correction had already been delivered into the pockets of every family member who once whispered about me, their phones buzzing with the confession my sister had hoped she would never have to make. I imagine them reading the words, some shocked, some defensive, some silently ashamed, and for a moment I almost pitied them, because what they were feeling in that instant was what I had lived with for years. But pity is a luxury I no longer owed anyone. As the ceremony began, I held my fiancé's hand and thought about how strange it felt that the most important part of the day had already happened before I even walked down the aisle. I had braced myself for sabotage, for interruptions, for some last attempt at manipulation, but instead what I got was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had forced the truth to stand where lies had once been applauded. My vows came easily, not because I had rehearsed them 100 times, but because I had finally unclenched the part of me that was always defending, always explaining, always on guard. I promised love, loyalty, and partnership, and for once I believed my words could stand without the shadow of my family's betrayal pressing down on them. After the ceremony, I made a choice that might have surprised anyone who had not lived my story. I walked up to my father, who was standing off to the side holding the weight of what had just unfolded, and I handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter, short and unadorned, that laid out the only terms under which we could ever rebuild a relationship. It said plainly that if he and my mother wanted to be part of my life moving forward, they would have to follow the same path I had given my sister, acknowledge what they did, put it in writing, and stop pretending that silence was the same thing as peace. Along with the letter was a prepaid shipping label for a box, not for presents, but for heirlooms or family items they wanted me to have when they were ready to act like parents again. I did not beg, I did not plead, and I did not soften the terms. I gave him the envelope, wished him well, and walked away without waiting for an answer, because I had finally learned that closure is not given. It is taken when you draw the line and refuse to step back over it. The rest of the night went by like a blur, laughter and music and the kind of small joys that never make it into the dramatic retelling of a story, but matter more than any headline moment. My sister sat quietly at a back table, no longer the star of her own cruel show, and my mother kept her distance, watching me with the same tight expression she wore the day she told me to leave home, except now it was lined with something that looked a lot like fear. I did not speak to either of them again that night, and I did not feel the need to. The correction was posted, the record had been reset, and nothing they could say would take that away from me. Later, when the guests had left and the lights were dimmed, I sat with my husband and told him something I had never admitted out loud before, that I had spent years wondering if I was going to die carrying their version of me, buried under lies I could never shake. That fear had haunted me more than any financial struggle or lonely night on a couch. And now, sitting in my own dress with the man I loved beside me, I knew I had buried the lie instead of letting it bury me. People think victory comes with fireworks or applause, but mine came with a file saved to my phone and a message sent to a group chat. It came with a notarized signature and a prepaid envelope. It came with silence where there used to be shouting. I did not win by screaming louder than my sister or by begging my parents to see me differently. I won by refusing to play the role they had written for me, by being patient enough to wait for the one day when my leverage was undeniable, and by making the truth louder than gossip without ever raising my voice. I do not know if my parents will ever follow the path I set for them, and maybe they won't, because some people find it easier to live with lies than to confront the shame of admitting they were wrong. But that uncertainty no longer keeps me awake at night. The prize I wanted, the applause, the approval, the warm place at the table, was never mine to win in the first place. The prize I did win, the one I built brick by brick, was peace under my own rules and the unshakable knowledge that I forced the story to change without begging for permission. And as I lay down that night, exhausted and calm in a way I had never been before, I realized that I did not need their love or their words to feel whole. What I needed was exactly what I had, the truth corrected, the record set straight, and a life that belonged only to me.